I've been interested in examining how the risk for depression is transmitted from the mother to their children. I'm particularly interested in looking at some of the underlying mechanisms in the process the process that link maternal depression and child adverse outcomes. Today I'm going to talk about maternal depression and child emotion regulation. Well, it's been there has been fairly robust finding that children of depressed mothers are at 3 to 4-fold of heightened risk for developing depressive, clinically significant forms of depression during childhood. About 40 to 45% of children with a depressed parent will experience an episode of major depression by late adolescence. If we count early adulthood, that percentage is going to be higher. Also, depressive disorders are often markedly severe in those children. In addition to that, these children also are at heightened risk to develop a whole host of other psychopathology or adjustment problems, including social, emotional problems, and academic difficulty. There have been some mechanisms that hypothesized that link maternal depression and child outcomes. This is the figure that I cut and pasted from Cheryl Goodman's review paper, and here she proposed that there are 4 of the mechanisms that related mother depression with children's vulnerability, which then further contributes to the developmental outcomes of child. So depressed mothers, 4 of these mechanisms include heritability of depression. We all know that depression runs in families. And innate dysfunctional neuroregulatory mechanisms. So for instance, children who are born to depressed mothers who experience high level of prenatal stress might be born with dysregulation in their initial in their physiological system in regulating stress. Exposure to mother's negative and or maladaptive cognitions, behaviors, and affect, and also exposure to stressful environment. My talk today is going to focus on these 2 components of this model. So I'm going to look at how depression is related to mother's maladaptive affect, behavior, and cognitions, which then contribute to children's cognitive and affective regulation, and then further outcomes. This is the study that I started after I came to the Ohio State University. In this study, I proposed that children's emotion regulation and attentional control are the sort of underlying mechanisms that link maternal depression and the related maladaptive functions to their future problems. This study focused on preschool-age children because the rate for depression is extremely low with these children. So the outcome, I've focused on child emotional behavioral problems, or also they're referred to internalizing and externalizing problems, which have been shown to be related to depressive symptoms later. For today's talk, I'm not going to talk about attentional control. I'm going to focus on the emotion regulation part. Emotion regulation, there are a variety of different definitions, and people focusing on this construct from different lines of research, their approaches are somewhat differently. But in general, most of the researchers in this field, they can agree that emotion regulation refers to skills and strategies that modulate emotion experiences and expressions in the service of contextual demands and personal goals. So the emotion regulation needs to be flexible, to be adaptive to the particular situational demands. And they need to regulate their emotion in such a way that that facilitates the goals and the particular goals that they are trying to achieve at any given moment. During the early childhood period, children began to develop self-regulatory skills in regulating their emotions. So the developmental trend of their emotion regulation goes from other regulation, that is, they rely on the regulation of their parents or others, adults, to their self-regulation. This is period that they gain the self-regulatory skills rapidly. But still, during this period, developmental period, mothers still, most of the mothers still are the primary caregiver of children. They still can exert strong influences in children's development of emotion regulation. So a large part of the emotion regulation skills developed in the parental socialization processes, which include modeling affect behaviors. So parents or particular mothers themselves, they will be confronted with situations that they need to regulate their own emotions. So children would observe. They learn from observing, or parents provide socialization from their modeling. And there are also emotion-related parenting practices that parents or mothers adopt. Just to include a couple of examples, for instance, emotion coaching, that refers to the extent to which the mother or the parents are aware of children's emotions, particularly negative emotions, whether they accept their expression of negative emotions or how they help them understand their own emotions or others' emotions. And also parents' reaction to children's emotions, that's related, whether they kind of punish them when they express certain negative emotions or they support them. And parents also provide emotional climate in the family, which refers to relationship qualities within the family. Well, how maternal depression is related to all of those parental behaviors and the ways in which that parents socialize children's emotion. First, we know that depressed mothers or depressed individuals in general, they tend to have deficits in regulating their own emotions. While for an individual to become depressed, he or she must have failed his initial attempt to regulate sadness or irritability. So depressed mothers, they tend to display more sadness or irritability. Also, they show lower levels of positive affect. Those are the hallmarks of depressive symptoms. Depressed mothers also tend to show maladaptive parenting practices. It's been found that depressed mothers tend to be more intrusive, more hostile when they interact with their children, and they also are less sensitive and responsive to their children. Children of depressed mothers have been found to develop difficulties in regulating emotions. For example, in some of the work that my colleague and I have done, we looked at children of mothers who had childhood onset depression, and we put them in situations where they're feeling disappointed or they're frustrated, and we found that children of depressed mothers, they tend to show less positive affect, they show more negative affect, and they also are more likely to adopt passive kind of regulating strategy, but relatively less active kind of regulating strategy. Oops. And dysregulated emotion in turn is related to children's future adaptive adjustment problems, including internalizing and externalizing problems. The overall aims of this study are to examine maternal depression and associated deficits in parenting as predictors of children's attentional control and emotion regulation. Again, I'm not going to talk about attentional control today. Also, another goal is to identify profiles of attentional control and emotion regulation and emotion reactivity as predictors of later child adverse outcomes. So for the data that I present today will only include emotion regulation, emotion reactivity. The subjects, participants were recruited from Columbus, Ohio area. The inclusion criteria for mother was that they need to be 21 years or older. They need to have a 3-year-old child. They had not been diagnosed with any psychiatric disorders other than depressive disorders, but comorbid anxiety disorders are allowed because of the high level of co-occurrence of the two. Children, they have to be, at the time of the lab visit, they have to be at 3 or 3.5, and they have to not have a history of developmental disorders or delays. We just finished the first wave of data collection, 3-year-old. Takes a long time. We ended up with 129 parent-child dyads. For mothers, their on average age was about 31 years old, and we have 58 mothers, 45% who had depressive symptoms as measured by the Center for Epidemiological Studies depression inventory that are above the clinical cutoff. We have the children, we have 51% boys and 49% girls, and their age is 3.2. I'm not going to present demographic information now. I will include that information for each individual studies I present later. The overall design, there's a longitudinal study with 3 time points. We started when the children were 3, and we followed them at 4 and 5. We finished the first wave. We're now about 2/3, I think, data collection for the second wave. We just started the third wave. Mother and child dyads are assessed in, they came to the lab. We have 2 to 2.5 hours lab visit in which the mothers are asked to interact with the child, or they're given different kinds of tasks to do together or separately. Mother also complete online questionnaires before they come into the lab. In addition to the lab visits, some of the children and mothers, if they choose to do so, They also participate in the home assessment, in which we ask the child to carry an iPod Touch, which is automatically turned on and off. It was just automatically turned on for 1 minute every 10 minutes. So we kind of record the sound in the child's naturalistic setting at home. So we can get the child's speech. We're interested in terms of what kind of emotional words they use, and also the conversation between the child and the parent. The first study I'm going to present is Emma Hooper's master's thesis. We're trying to get this out, hopefully soon. It's about the profile of mother's expression and depressive symptoms and stress, and how that's related to children's emotional regulation and their outcomes. There are two major objectives in this study. We wanted to identify distinct maternal profile of emotion expression, depressive symptoms, and stress. The rationale, we took a person-centered approach. The rationale is that from the literature, it seems that not all depressed mothers are the same. In the previous studies with other data set, we always find that it's almost always true that it's hard to find a direct link between maternal depression and child outcome. There's also some moderating factors. If the mother is depressed and she also does this or that, and then there's more likely to lead to negative outcomes. So it's very likely that all different factors that are interacting in predicting child outcome. So in this study, we're interested in identify these profiles to see how that is predictive of child outcome. And then we'll also look at the association between these profiles and children's observed positive and negative emotion expression and their internalizing and externalizing problems. In this particular study, we haven't updated our analysis yet. We have 100 mother-child dyads, and about half boys and half girls. Majority of the sample, mothers are Caucasian, 63%, 2/3 of the sample is Caucasian, and about 1/3 of the sample is African American. We have very few Asian American or American Indians. This sample is relatively highly educated. We have 56% of the mothers who had at least a bachelor's degree. And we have a quarter who had some sort of graduate level of education. In terms of income range, we have a very small percentage were either below $10,000 a year or above $150,000 a year. We have over about 60% who had at least $40,000 in terms of family income. So the mothers, again, the mother and children, they come to the lab visit. And for this particular study, we included the procedures from 2 tasks. One is cleanup task, it's 5 minutes. A mother is asked, so before the cleanup task, children and mother play in a free play setting with a lot of toys on the floor, and then the mother is instructed to ask her child to clean up all the toys and put them in a plastic bin. Mother is not supposed to help their child to actually do it, but mother is could instruct the child to do it. The instructions that they would do it as they normally would at home. So the cleanup is designed to generate or elicit a mild level of stress on the child. Usually children don't like to clean up, except, right? But we have a couple who really enjoy doing that. And Tickle Me Elmo is also 5 minutes. The mother and the child play together, the Tickle Me Elmo, and this is to elicit positive interaction between the mother and child. And then their interactions are videotaped and coded second by second for their emotion expressions. And I'm going to show you just a little bit about how the Elmo, Tickle Me Elmo episode.
All right, I guess it's Elmo time.
Yep.
Do you know that's a special kind of Elmo?
What kind is it?
Goes what? He does.
It
Can you tickle him again? Just give him a big squeeze, a big hug. He's so funny, isn't he? He's so funny. Oh my gosh, he's rolling on the floor laughing. Oh boy.
Okay. Well, that is a very positive episode. It's a very highly intensively positive. For the measures, we collect a mother's self-report on depressive symptoms using the CESD. Oh no, I'm sorry. We're using the back. We also asked the mothers to to rate their emotionality using the PANS. That is a questionnaire with 60 emotional words that describes emotional feelings or expressions, and ask the mother, how they're feeling on a rating scale. And then we collapse the positive words into positive emotionality and negative emotions into negative emotionality. And the maternal stress was assessed basically about, we asked the mothers to write the frequency and intensity of certain child-related stressors that they experience in daily lives. And we also asked the mother to rate children's internalizing, externalizing problems using the CBCL. We also collect some demographic information about the mother, including race, education, hours worked per week, number of children living in the household, employment status, marital status, and primary caregiver. Who is the primary caregiver of the child? Whether the mother is the primary caregiver. So for mother and child's emotion expression, their expression were coded in those videotaped episodes. So we based our coding on facial expression, verbal statement, and tone of voice, and gestures. So for instance, for positive affect, include smiling, laughing, clapping, and fear is indexed by wide-eyed expression or pulling away. Sometimes children would freeze. Sadness is based on crying or whining, and anger, frustration would be, stump or yelling, things like that. And for the variable we created for the analysis, those variables are the proportion of time spent on expressing affect, because oftentimes not the entire videotape are codable. Sometimes the children are out of the view. So we use all the codable time as the denominator. For data analysis, we conducted cluster analysis. When you have 100 participants, there's not much sophisticated analysis that you can do. We use this trying to kind of identify different clusters of mothers based on the expressed emotion and the self-rated emotionality, stress, both intensity and frequency, and mother's depressive symptom. We also were interested in who those mothers are who are following to different classes. So we also look at some of the demographic. We compare across groups their demographic information. And finally, we use that to predict child outcome. This is a list of variables that I talked about that went into the clustering of variable. Here is the result of the cluster analysis. We had 4 clusters. First one we labeled as happy. There are 32 mothers in it. That is characterized by high levels of observed positive affect and high positive emotionality. So both self-rated and observed are consistent. They're both high. And also low negative emotionality and low depressive symptoms and average levels of stress. And we have another group that almost is the opposite, which we call distressed. This group is characterized by low observed positive affect, again consistent, and high negative emotionality and high stress. And we have 2 other groups which are inconsistent or also inconsistent with the literature, but we thought that was more interesting. So there's an intense group with mothers who show high observed positive affect, but who rated themselves as average on positive emotionality. They show high negative, they self-reported high negative emotionality and elevated depressive symptoms, and they show average level of stress. On this flat group, there's low observed positive affect and average positive emotionality. There's low negative emotionality and low depressed symptoms, and average frequency and very low intensity of stress. So we call it flat because they show both, they're kind of low on both high and both positive and negative emotion. And we also looked at their demographic variables. So this happy group tend to have higher education than the others, versus the flat group tend to have lower education with others, compared to others. The intense group tends to work long hours, whereas the distressed group tend to work fewer hours than other groups. Finally, there are more Caucasian mothers in the distressed group, and more minority, basically more African American mothers in the flat group. This group we thought was those mothers who work long hours and maybe basically stressed overall, but somehow they're able to express very high intensity positive emotion when they interact with their children. In terms of how these maternal profiles are associated with children's outcomes, we looked at children's internalizing and externalizing problems. We also looked at children's positive emotion expression in Elmo episode. I just noticed that I didn't include that table in this PowerPoint. But we can just look at the outcome in internalizing and externalizing problem. The 4 groups are dummy-coded, so the happy group is used as a reference group. The results show that we did a hierarchical regression. We first control for children's gender, maternal education, and maternal race. And then add the grouping variable, and which shows that it's a distressed group. Children of distressed mothers tend to show higher levels of internalizing problems. And similarly, children of distressed group showing higher level of externalizing problems as well. I think the results was resistant that children of distressed mothers also show less positive emotion expression during the lab visits. So we found, just to summarize, we found 4 maternal profiles, 2 of which are consistent with what we know in the literature, and there is emotional congruence between what they actually display and what they self-reported is. And the other 2 is not consistent in terms of what they report and what they show. The happy group, the 2 emotional congruent group, it seems to be, as I said earlier, consistent with the literature. And this was also consistent with the depressive symptoms and the stress. So those who show high emotionality and high expressed emotion also tend to have lower depressive symptoms and lower levels of stress. Those who show high negative emotions in both self-report and expression, and the low positive emotion, they tend to have higher depressive symptoms and higher levels of stress. So these are the basic, it's very consistent with what we find in the literature. The intense profile is interesting. It has high levels of both positive affect expression and negative emotionality. So that's where it's inconsistent. And they did not report experiencing high positive emotionality, and they have moderate levels of elevated depressive symptom, and they work the greatest number of hours. So further in further studies, we might seek to try to kind of find explanations for how to explain these inconsistencies. But we thought our speculation is that those are probably those moms who work for longer hours, who generally stressed, but who are aware of our parenting skills, that they're aware that what's the kind of good parenting practice in terms of how they should interact with their children. In the other group, the flag profile, they have low levels of positive affect, low levels of negative affect. They don't feel at all, even though they report average levels of frequency of stress, but they report very low levels of intensity in stress. And children of the intense mothers, they don't show any negative outcomes, even though that those mothers don't express positive affectivity. This may help to explain some of the inconsistencies in the literature in terms of whether depressed mothers, whether sometimes you find that link with negative outcome and sometimes you don't. Sorry, any questions so far? In the second study, this is what we worked on for a presentation, for a conference in the summer, and we also try to hopefully turn it into a publication. We also took a person-centered approach. Instead of looking at the profiles of mother, we now look at the profiles of child, looking at the emotion expression and the emotionality that's also referred to as emotion reactivity, and see how that is related to mother socialization and children's further adjustment problems. The question that we're trying to address are how would different profiles of emotionality and regulation contribute to problem behavior, and then what's the role of maternal socialization. In this study, we have 107 preschoolers and their mothers. And the racial composition is similar to the previous one. And we also use both the laboratory visit data and also the mother report data. So we have child-reported emotions. This is a bit confusing. It's actually mother's reports of child emotions. That is collected using a temperament questionnaire by Rosbart and colleagues. In that questionnaire, mothers reported children's positive emotionality, like laughter, smiling, and negative emotions, sadness, anger, frustration, and fear. Children's observed emotions, similar, that are collected from those two observational tasks. And children's effortful control is also a mother's report using the CBQ. Basically, it's the extent to which that child can suppress their or inhibit their impulses in order to follow the rules or do something that they're supposed to do. And children's internalizing and externalizing symptoms. We also give mother a questionnaire and asking the mothers how they react when their child express negative emotions, including sadness, anger, and fear. Mothers answer those questions separately. So from those questionnaire, we used the two scales. We used one scale, that is the support. And maternal depressive symptoms is the same using the back. Again, we come up with 4 different profiles. The first profile is characterized by high levels of observed positive, okay? And the high levels of reported positive, again, it's consistent, and high levels of regulation. That's the effortful control that we use. The high level of child regulation. This accounts for about 40% of the data. The other profile is exuberant low control. We reported. It's also both high observed and reported positive emotions, and low negative emotions. It's the same as this group. The difference is that this group has relatively low regulation. effortful control. And this group has both high levels of observed in the mother's report of negative emotion and low positive emotion and low control. We labeled it as high negative, low control. And the last one, it shows high levels of observed emotion, positive emotion, but low levels of observed negative emotion, but the pattern is the opposite. There's low levels of reported positivity and high levels of reported negativity and low levels of regulation. So there's only one group with high levels of maternal report of regulation. To compare how these groups are different from each other in terms of child internalizing problems, the high positive, high control group and the exuberant low control group and high negative, low control group, they're all just showing the same levels of internalizing problem. It's only the inconsistent low control group showing the higher levels of child internalizing than other groups. Externalizing, the exuberant low control, so they show high levels of positivity but low level of negativity, and the high negative, low control, these two groups are the same, but these two groups showed higher levels of externalizing problems than the high positive, high control, and they're intermediate and they have low levels of externalizing problems with inconsistent low control. So that group showing the highest levels of externalizing problems. And to look at how these children's profile is related to mother depression and mother support. So the high positive, high control, which is more of the optimal developmental group, tend to have mothers who have the lowest level of depressive symptoms. And it is this high negative, low control group children whose mother tend to show the lowest level of support. So, well, it makes sense, right? If for children who tend to express a lot of negativity and out of control, it's hard for mothers to be supportive all the time. So again, just to summarize, the high positive, high control group, they seems like the most kind of the optimal group. They display most healthy functioning, and they have the lowest level of problem behavior, and they have low level of their mother have low level of depressive symptoms, and they have high levels of maternal support. Whereas the exuberant low control group, it really it's not much different between the high positive, high control group. They have somewhat higher externalizing problems, but it's not that not statistically significant. And high negative, low control group, they show high risk parenting practices because the mother shows lowest support to them, and they tend to have poorer child outcomes. The inconsistent low group, interestingly, these children do not receive lower levels of maternal support, but they tend to have show higher levels of externalizing problems. And we don't quite know how to explain this. it's possible that these mothers, try to pay much attention to these children, but we don't know why it's that there is inconsistency between the mother's support and the child outcome. Okay. I have originally I have one more to present, but I'm out of time.
If you have questions, Dr. Feng.
Well, just a general discussion. Overall, we were able to kind of, using different measurements, and we were able to find the link among maternal depression, mothers' parenting practices, and children's emotional regulation and their problem behaviors in different settings. And we were able to replicate those associations to some extent. But this is a cross-sectional data. We only use one wave of data, and hopefully we can get another wave soon so we can look at longitudinally.
Excuse me, have you ever compared, observed children who are not with their biological mothers and the effects of whether or not they are depressed? If their biological parents are depressed, is the child going to be, or is it more the environment that is shaping their behavior?
Yeah, that's a good question. In this study, I think most of the mothers are biological mothers. Yeah, so we can't really separate the kind of the familial, whether it's...
Yeah, the reason why I ask, I have a student in my classroom whose biological mother and his maternal grandmother had issues, and they both ended up incarcerated for murdering a woman. And I'm seeing this child's behavior. He's not around her or anything. He lives elsewhere, but I'm seeing some behaviors that are questionable, and I was wondering, just curious
about that. I know this is a common way to bring the parents in and record them, but I always wonder, do you think that there are kind of biases in how the parents behave then? I mean, you already saw some inconsistencies in what they recorded and what you actually saw in the videos, right? So do you think that's, like influencing your results? Do you think they would still be the same, or it's just kind of a watered down version of the parents' behavior that you're actually seeing?
Yes, that's a good point. One of the things that I put in the limitation is that we found that it's very hard. So originally we were going to look in Emma's thesis study, we were going to look at those maternal profiles in terms of how they predict children's expressed emotions in the lab settings. But we weren't able to look much do much on the negative emotion, because the distribution of variable is very skewed. There were very few mothers who actually showed any negative emotion. Eventually we'll have to make it dichotomize the variable and to do a logistic regression because of the distribution. I guess that's kind of the observational bias. They know that mothers know that they are observed, so I don't think that they would be less likely to show any negative emotions in the lab settings. And it's also true in other studies that I was involved in earlier, a larger scaled studies. It's also kind of hard to find. It's also with the negative emotions or any negative kinds of parenting you want to observe, there's also, the distribution is always not good. You know, you have fewer participants who ever showed that kind of negative behavior that you try to look at.
When you came up with the coding scheme for the children's
behaviors. Did you come up with that, or is that something that's been used in prior research?
We looked at several that have been used in published studies, and we kind of modified. We looked at several, and we used different part, or we made some modifications.
And I forget, was it positive and negative child behavior?
Right. So for child's emotion expression, we code for positive, and we separate three. We also coded for 3 types of negative: sadness, anger, frustration, and fear. And for mother, we only coded 2 types of negative: sadness and anger, frustration, because we didn't see any fear expression in the mothers.
Okay. And was the children's behavior based upon things they said and sort of physical, if they were laying on the ground or whatever?
Yeah. We looked at facial expression. That has the highest priority, and we also look at the statement that they make, but the statement itself does not qualify as positive if the tone is not positive. So we look at both the content, the contents and the tone of voice in terms of statement. We also look at the gestures. Sometimes fear and sadness, you will have to rely on some physical.
Right.
Sorry. I found the inconsistent low control group
Uh-huh.
cluster to be very fascinating because the children both have high numbers of internalizing and externalizing emotion problems, and mothers still give them a lot of attention. So I wonder whether you think there may be other environmental factors that may explain why these children have like that. Maybe they are divorced, or maybe there's something else going in the home or something like that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We should probably look at other kind of family variables, other demographic variables to see what could explain that. And it could also be possible that those children, they just tend to be difficult. There is such a thing as difficult temperament. So, even though that parents consistently show support, somehow they still kind of are difficult to manage.
I guess similarly, have you thought much about any bias that parents would have in their ratings of their children based on their own temperaments, and what does that alignment look like?
Yes, yeah, I think so. I don't know. I guess the design of should be with the data that I have. We probably won't be able to parse that out. But there are studies, previous studies showing that mothers, when they're asked to rate their own children in terms of temperament, and their rating is only correlated modestly with, like in a 0.3 maybe or lower, with skilled observer. But when mothers or parents, when the mothers are asked to rate other people's children, their rating is fairly close to the trained observer.
Which one's right?
Yeah, so which one is right? Yeah, that's a good question. So is the trained observer more, more accurate? The thing about observational study is that the lab procedure is that they all are based on very short time period. So it's 5 minutes, 3 minutes, or sometimes even 2 minutes. So is that less bias than mother's rating, who is with the child 24/7 for 3 years? I don't know. I mean, it would be really interesting, I think, if we could do this with a large-scale study, and if we could partial out with the method variance, I think.
Yeah.
But with observational study, I don't know, can we get, it took us 2.5 years to get 129. So I don't know how long it will take to get 500.